When I was making my first video, I thought to myself that it would be fun to make a video responding to one of those questions for atheists videos, because they're always quite fun to watch. But the problem was, well, they've already all been covered. There's a lot of them out there, and they're all old, and many atheists have responded to them already. So what I need is a new video, something that no one has covered yet. And that's when Braxton from Trinity Radio, the channel that I was responding to in my first video, released a video of 10 questions for atheists. So I thought, this is an opportunity I can't miss. So a quick introduction to Braxton questions. First, they're not meant as gotchas. He suspects atheists will have answers, and he wants to know what those answers are. 2, he wants atheists to ponder these questions deeply. He doesn't want glib answers. So with that said, let's go.
What facts about reality that you and I agree are real facts about the way the world is, does your worldview account for, but my Christianity doesn't account for, or at least doesn't account for well? And for those of you that would point out atheism isn't a worldview, I'm talking about your worldview that includes atheism. I can't think of any. Christianity accounts for evil, suffering, the existence of other religions, including supernatural events in those other religions, science, and differences among different denominations of Christianity. But I can think of many things that the most common worldviews that include atheism don't answer as well as I think Christianity does. Like universal supernatural claims, universal religious experiences, free will, morality, near-death experiences, beauty, the rapid expansion of the early church, the events surrounding the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth, and our shared longing for purpose and meaning. So what is it that Christianity doesn't answer as well as your worldview?
Before I answer this question, I first have to ask, what even is a worldview? Braxton poses questions which are related to a worldview. For example, where does suffering come from? Where does evil come from? Where do other religions come from? And experiences within those religions, and so on. Braxton puts forth Christianity, or a Christian worldview, as an answer for all of these questions, which seems to imply that a worldview is essentially an answer you give to all of these, which is an overarching answer, or rather, each answer to each of these questions is a subset of that group, in this instance, Christianity. If that's your definition of a worldview, then I don't have one at all. I take these questions one at a time and answer them one at a time. I don't need an overarching answer. If your worldview is simply your collection of answers to these questions, then I have to say they are very Christian-centric. As for the facts of reality that we agree on, no, I think my worldview answers them better than Christianity does. If I didn't, then I wouldn't really be an atheist. There are 3 things in your list which I don't consider to be facts. I don't think they're true, and those are
free will,
although it depends how you define free will.
The rapid expansion of the early church,
because I would more describe it as a pot slowly coming to the boil than a rapid expansion. And 3,
and our shared longing for purpose and meaning.
I don't think we all share a longing for meaning and purpose.
If your definition of atheism is merely that it's a lack of belief in God and you're just waiting to be convinced, but then you speak of him as though he's in some way synonymous with Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, or fairies, doesn't that at least send the message to your listeners that you actually believe that there is no God? After all, these are entities and beings that you likely believe do not exist. And if your response is that you merely lack a belief in Santa Claus and don't actively believe that he does not exist, doesn't that sound a little disingenuous, honestly?
First of all, a lack of belief in any gods is the definition of atheism. If you believe there are no gods, then you also lack a belief in gods. There is a little bit of dispute as to terms here, but I say someone who merely lacks a belief that gods exist is an agnostic atheist, whereas someone who believes that there are no gods is a Gnostic atheist. I used to be an agnostic atheist. I do, however, now say that I am a Gnostic atheist. But whether I'm agnostic or Gnostic, my answer to this question would be the same, which is I don't treat God, Santa, the Easter Bunny, etc. as synonymous. I do, however, make comparisons between them. Now, I know Santa isn't real, and I can say I know he isn't real because I know that he is some concept that is taught to children for entertainment during Christmas time. However, I can't say the same about any god. So I don't say I know God doesn't exist, I just say I think there are no gods.
When atheism becomes a part of someone's worldview, they typically change their positions on other issues like abortion, sexual morality, and a number of other things. I actually have several videos of well-known atheists saying that there's nothing wrong with prostitution, that they hope their children don't save themselves until marriage, and that sex workers should be put up on a pedestal no different than the military. I didn't use those here because I didn't want to seem combative to individuals, specifically the individuals who made those statements. But even if you didn't become an atheist just so you could sin, and I believe you, do you at least understand why those moves could send that message to people who might say that to you?
When atheism becomes a part of someone's worldview, they typically change their position on a lot of moral issues. For example, the eating of pork. Many atheists say there's nothing wrong with drawing Muhammad and even having friends who aren't of your religious affiliation. Hopefully you realize the reason I'm not a Muslim is not that I want to transgress against Allah. It's because I think Allah doesn't exist the same way you do. The thing about these morals is, outside of Allah told us that we had to do these things, there's no reason to do them. Just as outside of God told me that prostitution and abortion are wrong, there's no reason that they are wrong. And for any Christians watching this who then say, oh, well, why don't you go around killing people? There are reasons not to kill people outside of God tells us not to kill people. But specifically you asked, do I understand why Christians think that? And my answer is yes, I can understand it. But it does annoy me when someone has had this explained to them and then they go into the pews and continue to preach that that is why atheists are atheists.
If it's a lack of belief sort of atheism, what is it? Is it 50-50, 60-40, 75-25? And at what point do you feel disingenuous saying that you merely lack a belief as opposed to leaning towards, I believe that God does not exist?
I like this question, and the reason for that is because it's actually very similar to a question that convinced me to call myself a Gnostic atheist. I think it's a bit silly to put numbers on it though, as when I was an agnostic atheist, and even now as a Gnostic atheist, I don't put probability on whether or not God exists. So I'm actually going to try and improve this question for Braxton. In science, the highest level an idea can reach is the level of theory. Theory doesn't mean something is 100% proven, and the reason there's nothing higher than theory is it's us humbly acknowledging that we can't know for 100% certainty. I don't think many atheists would say that they're agnostic as to whether or not germs cause disease. So what level of certainty would you require before you were to acknowledge that you're not agnostic, but rather Gnostic?
Now, I know we've all got our talking points, but I want you to struggle to be as sincere with yourself as you can right now. Doesn't it bother you a little bit that when we come to talk about the origins of the universe, and if there's a multiverse, the origin of that too, that the only real options you've got besides God is a past infinite universe, which is impossible, or the universe coming to exist uncaused out of nothing, or something far less clear than even those? It seems that for any worldview that includes atheism, there's a massive blind spot when it comes to the origin of the universe. And all the attempts to try and circumvent that problem seem desperate and at least far less likely than theism. My question isn't just what do you typically say about this, because I'm well aware of the responses. My question is simply this: when you step away from the debate mode that it's so easy for us all to get into online, doesn't this issue destabilize you a little bit? It seems to fit really poorly with any worldview that includes atheism.
First off, the universe began 14 billion years ago with the Big Bang. If time, space, and energy existed before the Big Bang, which they likely did, then that's not considered the universe. It is, however, considered part of the cosmos. Personally, I suspect that the cosmos didn't begin and that it has always existed. I know a lot of theists will argue that an infinite regression is impossible, but I've yet to hear an argument that actually convinces me. But as you said, your question isn't about what I think happened, but,
Doesn't this issue destabilize you a little bit?
or as you put it in the first place,
Doesn't it bother you a little bit?
no, it doesn't bother me.
I hope my atheist interlocutors will consider these questions deeply without giving glib answers.
My answer is no, it doesn't bother me, but I do understand the feeling because I used to feel that way when I was a Christian, and for quite a while after leaving the faith too. Maybe you think this is a tangent, but I think the feeling you're describing is quite similar to something I disagreed with in question 1, namely,
And our shared longing for purpose and meaning.
I think that life in general, and my life specifically, have no ultimate meaning or purpose. But if someone were to come along tomorrow and conclusively demonstrate to me that my life has no meaning or purpose, I would feel neither sorrow nor joy about it. Likewise, if someone were to come along tomorrow and demonstrate that my life does have an ultimate meaning or purpose, I would again feel neither sorrow nor joy at this prospect. Don't get me wrong, I'm not completely indifferent to this question. The fact that a question has been asked has stoked my curiosity, and it would bring me some happiness to have that curiosity satisfied. But apart from that, I really don't care either way. My hopes aren't invested in one answer being correct over another. I know if you're a theist, it may be a little hard to empathize with my indifference, so to help you understand, I pose a counter question. If you were raised outside of Christianity or any other religion and never taught that life has an ultimate meaning or purpose, in fact, the question was never posed to you if life has an ultimate meaning or purpose, and someone were to approach you and ask, how would you feel if life had an ultimate meaning? Would you really care? I think the majority of people simply wouldn't care. Maybe some would, but I think the majority would not.
Of the arguments for God's existence, is there one that to you seems more interesting than the rest? Is there one that for you actually does weigh in favor of theism? Which one?
Of the arguments I've heard for God's existence, I don't think any weigh in favor of God existing. However, the one I do find the most interesting is the Kalam, because I do like to hear theist reasoning as to why a first cause has to be a god.
Most atheists I've met humbly admit that they don't think they can have absolute certainty about much of anything. But what they want from the Christian is a demonstration that God exists or that Christianity is true. Well, when we offer the reasons to believe that we do have, those are typically deemed not good enough. So what sort of evidence, if any, would be enough to convince you? Do you know?
Story time. Back when I was in school, I think I was 16 at the time, we were watching a documentary on Saint Bernadette and the apparitions of Our Lady at Lourdes in religion class. Quick summary of what that entails. Girl sees apparition of Mary. Girl goes to priest, says she's seen apparition of Mary. Priest says, I don't believe you. She goes back to apparition, and apparition says, tell him I am the Immaculate Conception. She goes back to priest, and priest thinks it's a miracle that a peasant girl knows 2 big words. But in the documentary, they showed the casket in which Saint Bernadette's body is contained. And the teacher paused the video at that point and explained that they had actually been to the place, and you can see the casket for yourself. One of us puts our hands up and says, how is the body so well preserved? To which her response was, well, it was a miracle. Her body was miraculously preserved, like many of the other saints' bodies have been. That caught my attention, and I immediately thought, well, I'm going to go and check if that's true once I'm home, because that's pretty compelling. Then the teacher hit play again, and the documentary essentially, at that moment, said that her body had been preserved. It actually turns out that her body hasn't been preserved, her body was cremated. A wax cast was made of her face and hands beforehand, however. There is some element of truth that her body was preserved, since her original body was exhumed at some point while she was being canonized, and it was found that she had gone through remarkably little decay for a body of her age. To call this a miraculous preservation is a bit of a stretch, because whilst her body wasn't as decayed as most bodies would be after the period of time she had been buried for, it wasn't highly unusual either. I mean, really, if it was a miracle of preservation, you'd think she'd be perfectly preserved, but she wasn't. For example, her nose was pretty rotten, and that's actually present on the wax cast of her. That was the closest I have been to returning back to Christianity. If her body was actually miraculously preserved, then I would find that pretty convincing. Of course, it on its own probably wouldn't be enough. I would have to look up other potential miracles related to other saints and beatification and other areas as well. But if you want to know what would convince me, well, something like that.
To what extent did social and moral issues start you down the path toward your atheism? That is to say, the typical Christian or religious views on sexuality, gender, rights, and acts and commands of God in the Old Testament. It seems that many deconversion stories online begin with, or at least include, LGBT issues, purity culture, or hell as instrumental in the deconversion process. It strikes me that what should matter most is the truth and not what we might prefer that the truth were. I honestly wonder how much those issues and ones like them motivate the deconversion rather than all this talk about evidence.
In my experience, the most common feature in deconversion stories tends to be the problem of evil, and personally, that didn't lead me down the path towards atheism. I had already thought and prayed about it and come to the conclusion that it wasn't a problem. Looking back, I now do disagree with my reasoning. Now, of the specific things Braxton brings up, sexuality, gender, purity culture, that had no impact on me because I was 11, for fuck's sakes. Acts and commands from God in the Old Testament didn't really have an impact either. Now, at the time I was 11, and I was learning Bible stories in religion class in school. However, those stories were generally very sugar-coated. For example, after Lot and his family escaped Sodom, we would learn that his wife was turned into a pillar of salt, but then we weren't taught about the incest that occurred between him and his daughters after that. Another example is the story of Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments. We were taught when he came down, he broke the tablets and he gave out to the people, and then he went back up to get new ones. Of course, it leaves out that several people were taken out the camp, handed swords, and told to go back in and kill those who remained. So the acts and commands of God in the Old Testament didn't have an impact on my deconversion because the ones I did know about, the bad parts were left out. The final thing Braxton brings up, hell, did have an impact, but it wasn't me seeing that it was morally wrong. It was more me recognizing that, well, if I'm wrong, I'm going to go to hell. Me essentially discovering Pascal's wager for myself. And yeah, it didn't stop me.
Can you name the last 3 academic books you read by theists on the subject? How long ago did you read them? Or is most of your understanding of apologetics and atheism from non-scholarly internet sources, pop-level books, and, let's face it, YouTube videos? And be honest with yourself about this. Anyone can Google up a list of books and paste them in the comments section. But I want to know, are you getting the best from the other side?
My knowledge of Christianity does not come from scholarly books. It comes from the fact that I used to be a Christian. And of course, since then, it also comes from YouTube videos, etc. I suppose the question that follows from this is, why haven't I read any Christian scholarly books? And the reason is because, why should I? What reason do I have to read Christian books over Buddhist books or Islamic books, and so on? The next question that follows from that then is, why don't I read scholarly works on all of the religions? And my response to that is, 1, I'm not a weirdo. 2, that's a lot of books. And 3, I cannot be asked. My final response to this question is actually a question itself, because my last couple of points were actually lies. I am a bit of a weirdo, and I can be asked. And my question is, do these count as scholarly?
Let's finish with a pretty common one. If you found out today to your satisfaction that Christianity were true, would you accept God's authority, repent of your sins, and trust Jesus as your king?
Now, I know when atheists answer this question, Christians tend to find it quite damning. But my answer is, it depends. First of all, it depends what damnation is like. If damnation is simply winking out of existence, then sign me up. I don't particularly want to live in a Hotel California. Next, it depends whether or not I embrace Christian morality or not. If it turns out God exists and his morality is perfect, and I recognize this, then yes, I would accept him. Finally, if it's not demonstrated to me that God's morality is infallible, then it depends whether or not I'd be accepted into heaven for not accepting that. If it were okay just to do God's works and not accept them as being infallible, then I would still be a Christian. But if that wasn't enough, then what's the point? So those are my answers to Trinity Radio's 10 Questions for Atheists. If you enjoyed, then please do leave a like, or maybe a dislike, or a comment, or maybe even subscribe. That would make me very happy. Goodbye. If I were to learn Christianity is true... I'll fuck you up!
Joe's never recording. Ah, damn! Man, I'd be looking fine as shit. Look at that phone!
I'll just wait for you to stop. I mean, I don't mind filming with you in the background.
God!
Just wait for you to stop all this.
Goddamn Joe action. Look at all that damn facial hair. Make me all look all kinds of fine. Damn. Right, Joe, go on.
Now, where was I? Finally, if it was demonstrated to me that...
I ain't do shit.
Well, you see, Tom, I do this anyway, even if you're not there.
Right, viewpoint.
So it's all about worldviews.
Worldviews, Joe.
Finally, if it weren't demonstrated to me that...
I gotta be religious as shit for you. I'm G, fam. I'm G. You gotta put some of this in.
Oh, I will. Oh, my fucking brain.
Someone has to pray for your soul.
Yeah, they're going to anyway, it's fine. How many people need to pray for my soul?
I don't even know if it's a bad thing.
And since it's often a conversation stopper, let's take experimental reproducibility off the table, since that's not even always necessary for science.
I do find it a bit weird that someone said...
That sex workers should be put up on a pedestal, no different than the military.
Not just because, well, they're sex workers, but it's actually kind of weird how Americans do put the military up on a pedestal. Being on this side of the Atlantic, I mean, yeah, we do respect the military, of course, but to glorify them to the same extent the Americans do, yeah, that seems a little bit weird.
Doesn't it bother you a little bit? It strikes me that what should matter most is the truth and not what we might prefer that the truth were.